Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Ashern Horror. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. Some of the scariest stories don't involve killers, ghosts, or monsters. Sometimes the most terrifying thing is nature. The ocean, a mountain, a cave, a place that existed long before humans arrived and will continue existing long after we're gone. This is one of those stories. I first heard about it years ago, and even though I can't remember every detail perfectly, the core of the story has never left me. It involved two friends who shared a passion for underwater cave exploration. Not ordinary scuba diving, not swimming near a beach. The kind of diving where people descend into dark underwater cave systems, navigating tunnels beneath the earth where sunlight never reaches. Even thinking about that hobby makes me nervous. Most people feel uncomfortable in caves. Most people feel uncomfortable underwater. These divers willingly combined both. They entered places where a simple mistake could become fatal. Places where getting lost often means there is no easy rescue. Places where every breath matters. On the day of the incident, the two friends entered a submerged cave system together. Everything appeared normal at first. They had likely done similar dives before. Experienced divers often train extensively for these environments because underwater caves are among the most dangerous places a person can explore. Unlike open water, there is no direct path to the surface. If something goes wrong, you can't simply swim upward. You have to find your way back through the tunnels. At some point during the dive, the two divers became separated. Exactly how it happened depends on which version of the story you hear. But what everyone agrees on is that one diver somehow disappeared. One moment he was there, the next he wasn't. His friend searched, called for him, looked everywhere he could. Nothing. The situation made very little sense. The cave passage wasn't an open ocean where someone could drift away for miles. It was a confined underwater system. There seemed to be very few places for a person to go, yet the diver was gone. When he failed to reappear, rescue efforts began. Time became critical. Underwater emergencies move fast. Every passing minute reduces the chances of a successful rescue. Experienced search teams were eventually brought in. Among them was a professional diver with far more training than most people could imagine. If anyone could solve the mystery, it would be someone like that. The rescue diver entered the cave system and began searching. Tunnel after tunnel, passage after passage, looking for any sign of the missing man. A piece of equipment, a trail, anything, but there was nothing. No diver, no body, no clear explanation. Then the search diver noticed something unusual. A feeling, not a sound, not a sight, a sensation, a current pulling at him. At first it may not have seemed important. Water currents exist in many cave systems. But this felt different, stronger, more focused, almost as if something beneath him was actively pulling water downward. Curious and concerned, he investigated further. What he found was unsettling. Somewhere beneath the lake or cave system appeared to be a deep opening. A shaft, a drain, a submerged passage. Exactly what it was remains difficult to describe. But according to the stories surrounding the case, it seemed to generate a powerful suction effect. The deeper he examined it, the stranger things became. To estimate its depth, a chain was lowered, not a short chain, a very long one. The story often describes it as hundreds of feet long. around 500 feet. The expectation was that eventually the chain would hit bottom. It never did. The chain continued downward. Still no bottom. Still no answer. Just darkness. Endless darkness. Imagine standing above something like that. A hole beneath a lake. A hole disappearing into the earth. A hole so deep that even hundreds of feet of chain fail to reveal where it ends. The idea alone is enough to make my skin crawl. As the investigation continued, a theory began to emerge. Perhaps the missing diver had become disoriented. Underwater cave diving places enormous stress on the body and mind. Divers must constantly monitor breathing systems, air supply, navigation, depth, and direction. A single problem can quickly become overwhelming. Some people suggested that a breathing-related issue may have contributed. Maybe confusion, maybe impaired judgment, maybe some kind of physical or mental distress during the dive. Whatever happened, the theory suggested that he may have unknowingly drifted toward the suction area. Once caught in a strong current, escape could become impossible. Water is incredibly powerful, far more powerful than most people realize. A current that seems manageable at first can quickly become overwhelming, especially inside a confined underwater environment. If the theory was correct, he may have been pulled into the opening. Beyond that point, nobody knew what happened. And that's where the story becomes truly disturbing. Because nobody seems to know where that passage actually leads. Think about that for a moment. An opening exists beneath the water, powerful enough to create noticeable suction, deep enough that an extremely long chain fails to find the bottom, connected to some unknown underground system, and nobody can fully map it. The human mind struggles with mysteries like that. We want boundaries. We want measurements. We want answers. How deep is it? Where does it go? What's at the end? But sometimes nature doesn't provide those answers. Some versions of the story mention water tracing tests. Investigators reportedly introduced tracking materials into the system to see where the water traveled. The results suggested that water emerging from the system appeared incredibly far away, much farther than anyone expected. The implication was astonishing. If true, it meant the underground network stretched vast distances beneath the surface, not just beneath one lake, not just beneath one cave, potentially through an enormous hidden system buried beneath the earth. Whether every detail of that claim is accurate, I honestly don't know. Stories evolve over time. Facts get mixed with rumors, people add details, memories change. But even if only part of it is true, it's still enough to be unsettling, because it reminds us how little of the world we actually see. We look at a lake and assume we understand it. We look at a calm surface and think we know what's underneath. Yet beneath that water may exist tunnels, caverns, and underground rivers stretching farther than we can imagine. Entire hidden landscapes, places humans rarely visit, places where a person can disappear. What haunts me most about the story isn't the mystery itself. It's the missing diver. One moment he was exploring with a friend. The next, he was gone. No dramatic storm, no obvious disaster, just a disappearance into the darkness below. Whenever people talk about fears, many mention heights or spiders. For me, stories like this create a different kind of fear. The fear of hidden places, the fear of vast spaces existing beneath our feet, the fear of something so deep and unknown that even trained experts cannot fully explain it. Because at the end of the day, the cave wasn't evil. The water wasn't evil. Nature wasn't evil. It simply existed. And sometimes that's even scarier. A silent opening beneath the surface, a current pulling downward, hundreds of feet of darkness, and a mystery that may never be completely solved. Some memories fade with time, faces become blurry, conversations disappear, details get lost. But there are certain moments that stay with you forever. No matter how many years pass, they remain just as clear as the day they happened. For me, one of those memories comes from New Year's Day in 2007. I was only 7 years old. At that age, most children are worried about toys, cartoons, and school. Violence was something I only saw in movies. Real-life danger was something I barely understood. That changed in a matter of minutes. My family lived in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other. The houses weren't far apart, so it wasn't unusual to hear people talking, arguing, or celebrating outside. Since it was New Year's Day, there was already a lot of activity around the area. People were outside. Some were still celebrating from the night before, others were visiting friends and family. It seemed like a normal day. At first, I didn't think anything unusual was happening. I noticed two of my neighbors arguing. That wasn't completely uncommon. Arguments happen everywhere. Sometimes people get angry. Sometimes they yell. Usually it ends there. At least that's what I thought. The argument quickly became more intense. Even as a child, I could tell this wasn't a normal disagreement. The shouting grew louder. Their movements became more aggressive. People nearby started paying attention. Something felt wrong. I remember standing there watching, not fully understanding what I was seeing. Part of me expected someone to step in and stop it. Part of me expected the two men to calm down and walk away. Instead, the situation became something far worse. At some point, weapons appeared. To this day, that moment feels surreal. 1 second, it was an argument. The next, it looked like something from another century. The two men were now facing each other with swords. Even now, when I replay the memory in my head, it feels unreal. As a 7-year-old child, I couldn't process what was happening. I had seen toy swords before. I had seen action movies. But I had never seen real people trying to hurt each other with real weapons. The atmosphere changed instantly. The argument disappeared. Now it was something much more dangerous. For a few moments, they circled each other. Everything felt tense. People were shocked. Nobody seemed to know what to do. Then the fighting began. At that age, I didn't fully understand what I was witnessing. I only knew that it was terrifying. The sounds were different from anything I had heard before. The movement was fast. The reactions from people nearby were filled with panic. I remember feeling frozen, unable to look away, unable to understand why nobody was stopping it. As the fight continued, the reality of what was happening became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a movie. This wasn't television. These were real people, real weapons, real injuries. The violence unfolded in front of everyone. The thing that has stayed with me most isn't one specific action. It's the overall feeling. The shock. The confusion. The realization that human beings can suddenly become incredibly dangerous when anger takes control. I remember seeing injuries that no child should ever witness. I remember seeing the reactions of people nearby. I remember hearing screams. I remember the chaos that followed. Everything happened so quickly, yet at the same time it felt like time had slowed down. When you're a child, moments like that become burned into your memory. You don't necessarily understand every detail. You don't understand motives. You don't understand consequences. But you understand fear. And I was terrified. The adults around me were terrified too. What had started as an argument had become a life-or-death situation. People who had probably started the day expecting a normal holiday suddenly found themselves witnessing extreme violence. Eventually, the fight ended, but the images remained. The sounds remained. The feeling remained, even after the people were gone, even after the street returned to normal, even after life moved forward. Years passed. I grew older. I experienced many other things. I moved through childhood, then adolescence, then adulthood. Most memories from when I was 7 became fragmented. Many disappeared entirely. Yet this one never did. I can still remember standing there. I can still remember the feeling in my stomach. I can still remember the confusion of trying to understand why 2 grown men were willing to destroy each other's lives over whatever disagreement had started it all. Looking back now, what affects me most isn't the violence itself. It's the fact that I was so young. Children aren't supposed to witness things like that. A 7-year-old shouldn't have to learn how fragile life can be. A 7-year-old shouldn't have to watch adults lose control in such a devastating way. But life doesn't always protect us from those moments. Sometimes we're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sometimes we see things we can never completely forget. For years, certain images from that day would randomly return to me. A sound, a movement, a flash of memory. Something would trigger it, and suddenly I was back there again. Standing in the street as a child, watching something I couldn't fully understand. Even now, nearly 2 decades later, I still remember it with surprising clarity. Not because I want to, not because I think about it every day, but because some experiences leave permanent marks on your memory. The older I get, the more I realize that many people carry moments like that. A car accident they witnessed, a tragedy they happened to see, a terrible event that arrived without warning and stayed forever. This is mine. A New Year's Day that should have been ordinary. A childhood afternoon that should have been forgotten. Instead, it became one of the clearest memories of my life. A reminder that real-life violence is very different from anything shown in movies, and a reminder that some things once seen can never truly be unseen. Looking back now, there are a lot of things from my childhood that seem completely normal at the time, but sound absolutely insane as an adult. This is one of those memories. My mom was the kind of person who knew everybody, not just a few neighbors. Everybody. If someone moved into the neighborhood, she knew them. If someone had family visiting from another city or another state, she probably knew them too. Our house was one of those places where people constantly came and went. Because of that, parties weren't unusual. Every few weeks there seemed to be some gathering happening at our house. Friends, family, friends of friends. Cousins, neighbors, random people who somehow knew somebody there. As a kid, I barely paid attention to any of it. The adults would be downstairs talking, laughing, drinking, and having a good time while I stayed upstairs doing my own thing. One particular night stands out more than any other. At the time, I was probably somewhere between 8 and 10 years old. I remember it pretty clearly because of how strange everything felt afterward. Like most nights when my mom had people over, I was upstairs getting ready to sleep. I had this weird habit as a kid. For some reason, instead of sleeping in my actual bed, I liked making giant piles of blankets on the floor. Looking back, it makes absolutely no sense. I had a perfectly good bed sitting a few feet away, yet I would spend 20 minutes building what looked like a blanket fort collapsed onto itself, and then sleep there instead. To me, it was comfortable. So, that's exactly what I had done that night. I had my blankets arranged on the floor and was getting ready to sleep. Meanwhile, the party downstairs seemed to be going well. At least I assumed it was. I wasn't paying attention. I was busy listening to music. At the time, I was obsessed with Michael Jackson. I remember listening to the Thriller album through my headphones while trying to fall asleep. Everything felt normal. Safe, routine. Then I started hearing noises from downstairs. At first it was laughter. Nothing unusual. People always laughed during these parties. Then I heard arguing. Again, not completely unusual. A lot of adults drinking together eventually leads to disagreements. Then came yelling, loud yelling, the kind that instantly grabs your attention. I took off my headphones. The music suddenly disappeared, and all I could hear were angry voices downstairs. Being curious, I left my room and started heading down the stairs. When I reached the bottom, I could see that something serious was happening. My mom was arguing with one of our family friends, or at least someone who was close enough to the family that they were always around. Everyone seemed tense. People were trying to calm each other down. From what I understood, two men had gotten into some kind of dispute. Both had been drinking. One of them was outside, the other was inside, and neither seemed interested in calming down. Apparently one guy had challenged the other to come outside and fight. The situation was already ridiculous. A house full of adults acting like angry teenagers. But then, things got much worse. The family friend suddenly grabbed a gun. Even as a child, I understood enough to know that wasn't good. The mood in the room changed immediately. People who had been arguing suddenly became concerned. My mom immediately started trying to stop him. The guy was furious. I remember him saying something about shooting the other man. The exact words are burned into my memory. He was angry enough that he actually started moving toward the stairs. His plan, as crazy as it sounds, was to go upstairs and shoot through a window. The fact that this was happening in a house full of people is still unbelievable to me. As he started up the stairs, my mom was practically begging him not to do it. I remember her yelling. I remember hearing panic in her voice. Then she said something that caught my attention. She reminded him that I was there. And then she said something else, something that completely stunned me. She told him the gun had already gone off once earlier that night inside the house. At the time, I don't think I fully processed what that meant. I was a kid. Adults said strange things all the time. I didn't immediately realize how serious it was. Eventually, people managed to calm the situation down. The argument started fading. The shouting became quieter. People were trying to move on. The immediate danger seemed over, and that's when something strange happened. For reasons I still can't explain, I looked up at the ceiling. I don't know why. Nobody told me to. Nothing drew my attention there. I simply looked up. At first I noticed a small dark spot. Nothing special, just a black mark on the ceiling. Then I looked closer. It wasn't a stain. It wasn't dirt. It was a hole. A small hole. Suddenly my curiosity kicked in. Even as a kid, I was always trying to figure things out. I remember standing there, staring at the ceiling. Then I started thinking, if there was a hole in the ceiling, then what was above it? My room. Specifically, the exact area where I had been sleeping. So I walked back upstairs. I entered my room. I looked around. Then I noticed where my blanket pile and pillow were sitting on the floor. And slowly something clicked inside my head. I walked back downstairs. Then back upstairs again, trying to line everything up. The hole in the ceiling. The location in my room. The path a bullet would have traveled. Even as a child, I could see the connection. The realization was surreal. The gun that had apparently discharged earlier that night had fired upward, and based on where the hole was located, it appeared to have traveled into the floor of my room, near the exact place where I had been sleeping. The strange part is how casually I reacted. Children process danger differently. An adult would probably panic. An adult would demand answers. An adult would refuse to sleep there. I did none of those things. I simply stood there for a moment, thought about it, put my headphones back on, turned Michael Jackson back up, and went to sleep. Looking back, that's probably the funniest part of the entire story. As children, we have no concept of how close we sometimes come to disaster. We don't understand probabilities. We don't understand consequences. We don't understand how easily things could have gone differently. Years passed. I grew up. Life moved on. The whole eventually became just another strange memory, one of many stories buried in my childhood. Then, more than a decade later, I was talking with my mom about old family stories. The conversation somehow drifted back to that party. We started remembering different details. People who were there. The argument. The chaos. And finally I told her what I had figured out that night. I reminded her about the hole. I reminded her where it was. Then I explained what I had realized as a kid, that the bullet appeared to have entered the floor of my room right near where my pillow had been. For a moment, we just looked at each other. Then we laughed. One of those awkward laughs people make when something is too uncomfortable to fully process, because underneath the humor was a terrifying thought, a tiny difference in angle, a slightly different position, a few inches one direction or the other, and the story might have ended very differently. That's what stays with me now. Not the argument, not the drunk adults, not even the gun. It's the realization of how unaware I was. While grown adults were creating chaos downstairs, I was upstairs listening to Thriller and building blanket forts on the floor, completely oblivious to how close danger may have come. And honestly, that's probably the most frightening part of the entire story. Sometimes the moments that almost change your life forever are the ones you don't even recognize until years later. This is one of the strangest experiences I have ever had, and even years later I still get chills whenever I think about it. It happened while I was studying at a boarding school. Anyone who has ever lived in a boarding school knows that it becomes your entire world. You sleep there, study there, eat there, and spend almost every hour of the day with the same people. Friendships form quickly because everyone is constantly around each other. That particular year was especially unusual for me because there were only 2 other girls in my grade. Naturally, the 3 of us became extremely close. We studied together, ate together, and spent most of our free time together. The hostel itself was filled with students from different parts of the country. Everyone came from different cultures, spoke different languages, and had different traditions. Among the younger students were 2 girls who I'll call A and B. They were sisters and were known throughout the hostel for being extremely religious. Even by the standards of a boarding school, they stood out. They prayed regularly, followed their beliefs very strictly, and often talked about spiritual matters. Since my friends and I were young and curious, we would sometimes sit with them and ask questions about religion and their hometown. A and B would tell us stories that sounded unbelievable. Stories about people being cursed. Stories about black magic. Stories about strange things happening in villages far away from the city. At the time we listened because the stories were interesting. Most of us didn't really know what to believe. We were teenagers. Everything mysterious sounded fascinating. Months passed, and life continued normally. Then summer arrived, along with our half-yearly exams. The entire hostel was stressed. Everyone was staying up late studying. Coffee, tea, and lack of sleep became part of daily life. One night, my 2 closest friends and I were studying together in our dorm room. It was probably around 1 or 2 in the morning. The dorm was mostly quiet. Rows of bunk beds stretched across the room. Most of the girls were asleep. Only a few lamps remained on. The 3 of us were sitting together on my bed, surrounded by books and notes. At some point, while reading, I looked up. Something immediately caught my attention. I could see A's legs hanging off her bed. At first, that wasn't strange. People move around while sleeping. But then, I noticed something odd. Her legs were moving rapidly, back and forth, up and down. The movement seemed unnatural. I stared for several seconds before nudging my friends. "Look," I whispered. Both of them looked over. For a moment, nobody spoke. The three of us simply watched. The movement continued. Eventually, curiosity overcame fear. Slowly, we climbed off the bed and approached her bunk. The room suddenly felt much quieter than before. Every sound seemed louder. Every shadow seemed darker. We carefully called her name. No response. One of my friends called again. Still nothing. Then, just as we got close enough to the bed to see her clearly, something happened. Her legs suddenly snapped back onto the mattress. Instantly, without warning. One moment they were hanging over the edge. The next, they were perfectly positioned on the bed. We looked up. O was lying completely still, flat on her back, her body straight and rigid. She looked deeply asleep, not moving, not reacting, not even aware that three terrified girls were standing beside her. That was enough for us. We immediately ran from the dorm. None of us stopped until we reached the hallway. My friends eventually convinced themselves it was probably some strange sleeping habit. Sleepwalking exists. People talk in their sleep. People do unusual things while unconscious. Maybe it was something like that. I tried to accept that explanation. Still, something about it bothered me. To calm down, I took a long shower. The hot water helped. Eventually, my heart stopped racing. By the time I finished and returned to the dorm, it was around 3 in the morning. Most of the lights were off. The room was almost silent. I walked toward my locker. The lockers had mirrors attached to them, and I stood there drying my hair and combing it before going back to bed. My friends were still studying nearby. Their backs were facing me. Everything felt normal again. I looked into the mirror while combing my hair. Nothing unusual. Then I turned away briefly to place the comb down. Only a second. Maybe less. When I looked back into the mirror, I nearly screamed. I was standing directly behind me, not across the room, not walking toward me. Right behind me, close enough that I could clearly see her reflection. I froze. Then I screamed and threw myself onto the nearest bed. The thing that terrified me wasn't simply seeing her. It was the distance. A's bed was several meters away. There was no way she could have crossed the room so quickly without me noticing. Yet there she was, standing silently, looking at me. She didn't react to my scream. She didn't speak. She didn't seem confused. She simply stared. My friends spun around in panic. All three of us were terrified. I remained expressionless. Then, after what felt like forever, she slowly turned and walked toward the washroom. A few moments later, B woke up. Without saying much, she followed her sister. Eventually, she brought A back to bed. The entire thing felt surreal. The next morning, I tried convincing myself that exhaustion had made everything seem worse. We had been studying for exams. We weren't sleeping properly. Maybe we were overreacting. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Life moved on, at least for a while. Then something happened a few nights later that completely destroyed any sense of comfort I had left. That night, one of my classmates and I were awake doing laundry. Boarding school life meant handling your own chores, and we often stayed up late washing clothes. It happened to be a Wednesday, which was usually when blankets were taken outside to air out after returning from the laundromat. We carried buckets of clothes and climbed 3 flights of stairs toward the rooftop terrace. The terrace was mostly empty at night. Dark, quiet, windy. When we arrived, we discovered there wasn't much space left to hang our clothes. Blankets were already covering most of the lines. We moved one aside and immediately froze. Standing only a short distance away was A. Her back was facing us. She was wearing the same green sleep shirt she often wore at night. Her curly hair was clearly visible. Everything about her appearance looked normal. She was simply standing there, looking up at the sky. Not moving, not speaking, just standing. My classmate laughed nervously. A, "What are you doing up here? You're scaring us." No response. Not even a slight movement. We exchanged looks. I continued hanging clothes while my classmate tried again. Hey, what are you looking at?" Still nothing. Now the atmosphere felt wrong. The silence was uncomfortable. The way she stood there was uncomfortable. My classmate suddenly nudged me. Her face had changed completely. "Let's go," she whispered. I was confused. I didn't understand why she seemed so frightened. Without warning, she abandoned her bucket and ran. Actually ran, straight toward the stairs. I stared after her, then looked back toward A one final time. Something felt deeply unsettling. I couldn't explain it, but every instinct told me to leave. So I ran too. The two of us sprinted down all 3 floors without stopping. We burst into the dorm room out of breath, then immediately looked toward A's bed. And there she was, sleeping peacefully, exactly where she should have been. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. We simply stared. The room suddenly felt colder. Eventually we found B and told her everything. The 3 of us went back upstairs to investigate. Nothing was there. No one. The terrace was empty. On the way back down, my classmate finally told me something she had noticed, something I hadn't. She asked if I had looked at A's feet. I said no. Then she quietly told me they had looked wrong. According to her, they appeared inverted, turned the wrong way. I immediately felt sick. To this day, I'm grateful I never noticed that detail myself. The image I already had was disturbing enough. Months later, we heard that A had returned to her hometown for some kind of spiritual treatment. People said she had been cursed. People said rituals had been performed. People said the problem had been removed. Whether that's true or not, I honestly don't know. What I do know is that after she returned, everything stopped. No more strange incidents. No more unsettling encounters. No more late-night stories. Life became normal again. Over time, A became one of our closest friends. She's still in our lives today. Whenever we bring up those events, she laughs and insists we're exaggerating. According to her, we're making everything sound far more dramatic than it really was. Maybe she's right. Maybe there are explanations for everything. Sleepwalking, exhaustion, stress, coincidence. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that every time I remember that green shirt, that curly hair, and that silent figure standing on the rooftop under the night sky, I still feel the same chill run down my spine. And no matter how many years pass, I don't think I'll ever completely forget it. Some childhood memories fade away with time. You forget faces. You forget conversations. You forget what happened at school last week or what toy you wanted for your birthday. But every now and then, something happens that becomes permanently burned into your memory. No matter how many years pass, you can still remember exactly how it felt. This is one of those memories for me. I was 12 years old. At the time, my family had recently moved into a new apartment complex. Everything about the neighborhood felt unfinished. The buildings were new. The roads were new. Most of the apartments were still empty. Only a handful of families had moved in so far. Because of that, the area felt incredibly quiet compared to other neighborhoods. There weren't many people walking around. There weren't many cars parked outside. Most nights felt almost deserted. But despite that, everyone considered it safe. Maybe because it was new. Maybe because there were so few people around. Or maybe because nothing bad had happened there yet. Whatever the reason, none of us were afraid of being outside. Even late at night, directly underneath our apartment building was a small convenience store. It wasn't anything special, just a simple neighborhood shop where people bought snacks, drinks, and basic groceries. Because the area was so quiet, The store often became a place where kids would meet before hanging out together. One particular night, I was waiting outside for a friend. It was much later than I should have been awake, close to midnight. Looking back, I'm surprised my parents even allowed it. But things were different back then. I was standing right in front of the apartment entrance, waiting for my friend to come downstairs. She lived in the same building. All she had to do was leave her apartment and come outside. Simple. Or at least it should have been. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. She still hadn't appeared. I was getting bored. Then annoyed. Then frustrated. Every kid knows that feeling when you're waiting for someone who promised they'd be ready in 5 minutes, but somehow takes forever. I remember staring at the apartment entrance and rolling my eyes. Finally, I shouted, "Come on, bro. Why is this taking so long?" "Hurry up," my voice echoed slightly through the quiet night. No answer. Nothing. Just silence. I sighed and continued waiting. The apartment entrance was visible because of a streetlight nearby. The light wasn't particularly bright. It illuminated the doorway and a small area around it. Everything beyond that seemed swallowed by darkness. Behind me was the road where the occasional car passed by. In front of me was the apartment entrance. And surrounding everything else was darkness. The kind of darkness that makes ordinary places feel unfamiliar. At the time, I wasn't scared. I was simply irritated. I stood there staring at the doorway, mentally complaining about how slow my friend was. I remember thinking she was being lazy. I remember wondering what could possibly be taking so long. Then something happened. Something so quick that even today I'm not completely sure how to explain it. As I stared toward the entrance, I saw movement. A shape. A shadow. Something. It appeared at one side of the doorway and shot across to the other side. Fast, extremely fast. Faster than any person should have been moving. One moment it was there. The next moment it vanished into the darkness. Gone. Completely gone. At first my brain struggled to process what I had just seen. I blinked, looked again. Nothing. The doorway was empty. The darkness around it remained still. There was no one there, no person walking by, no child running around, no neighbor entering the building. Nobody. The thing that frightened me most wasn't what I saw. It was the fact that there was nowhere for it to go. The area was empty. The apartments were mostly vacant. Almost nobody was outside at that hour, and yet something had crossed the entrance in front of my eyes. For a second, I simply froze. Then panic hit me. I screamed, "Oh my God, there's something at the apartment door." The words came out before I even realized I was saying them. My heart started racing. Every instinct told me to run. So I did. I turned and sprinted. At that exact moment, my friend was finally coming upstairs from the convenience store below. Apparently, she had been there the whole time. She looked completely confused as she saw me running toward her. I must have looked terrified, because she immediately stopped smiling. "What happened?" she asked. But I was too panicked to explain properly. I just kept yelling that something was there. Something near the entrance. Something I had seen. The fear in my voice clearly affected her because she immediately started running too. At first, she was running toward me. Then we were both moving away from the entrance. Everything happened so fast. Then suddenly she fell. Hard, right in the middle of the road. At first I thought she had simply tripped. Maybe she stepped wrong. Maybe she lost her balance. But when I ran back to help her, she looked absolutely terrified. Not embarrassed, not annoyed. Terrified, the kind of fear that makes your face lose all color. Tears immediately filled her eyes. For a moment she couldn't even speak. Then she finally looked at me and said something that made my stomach drop. Someone grabbed my leg. She was crying by then. Actually crying. Not the kind of crying a kid does after scraping their knee. This was genuine fear. She kept insisting that something had held onto her leg while she was running. Not brushed against it, not bumped into it, grabbed it. The road around us was empty. No one was standing nearby, no one was hiding behind a car, no one was playing a prank. There was simply nobody there. The two of us stood frozen, too scared to move, too scared to look around. Every shadow suddenly felt threatening. Every dark corner suddenly felt alive. The apartment building that had always seemed safe now felt completely different. We eventually made our way upstairs. Neither of us wanted to stay outside any longer. The excitement of hanging out was gone. All we wanted was to get inside and lock the door. When I told my parents what happened, they didn't take it seriously. To be fair, I understand why. Parents usually look for logical explanations. They assumed someone had passed by. Maybe I saw a person running. Maybe my friend tripped. Maybe we scared ourselves. That was their explanation. But the problem was that we knew what we experienced. We both knew the area had been empty. We both knew what we saw. And we both knew how terrified we had felt. Nobody believed us. Eventually, life moved on. Days became weeks. Weeks became years. The apartment complex filled with more residents. The neighborhood became busier. The strange night faded into memory, at least partially. But even now, years later, I can still remember every detail. The dark apartment entrance, the quiet road, the yellow glow of the streetlight, the shadow crossing the doorway, my scream, my friend's terrified face, and the moment she looked at me and said someone had grabbed her leg. Maybe there was a logical explanation. Maybe there wasn't. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that even after all these years, whenever I think about that night, I feel the same chill I felt when I was 12 years old, standing alone outside that apartment building. And sometimes that's what makes a memory truly frightening. Not that you saw something strange, but that decades later, you still can't explain it. First, here's the rewritten version. I was either in the 11th or 12th grade when this happened. Even now, years later, it remains one of the strangest experiences of my life. I've tried many times to find a logical explanation for what happened that night. Sometimes I convince myself there must have been one. Other times I remember exactly how real everything felt, and I find myself questioning it all over again. This happened during the COVID-19 lockdown. Like most families at that time, our lives had changed completely. Schools were closed, businesses were shut down, and everyone was trying to figure out how to live through something none of us had ever experienced before. My entire family decided to leave the city for a while and stay in our home village. At first, everyone thought the lockdown would only last a few weeks. Then a few weeks turned into months. Before we knew it, almost a year had passed. By that point, most educational institutions had shifted online. Classes were happening through phones and laptops instead of classrooms. But as restrictions slowly started easing, my college announced that final exams would be conducted physically. There would be no online exams. Students had to appear in person. That meant I needed to return to our house in the city. Since the rest of my family was still staying in the village, my elder sister decided to come with me so I wouldn't be alone. Our house had been mostly empty for months. Even though it was our own home, returning after such a long time felt strange. The rooms felt quieter than I remembered. The halls seemed emptier. There was something unsettling about being in a place that had been unoccupied for so long. Still, I had exams coming up, so I focused on studying. One night, while preparing for an exam, I was sitting alone in the TV lounge. My sister was in her room, doing her own work. The house was silent. Outside, the streets were unusually quiet because of the lockdown restrictions. The only real sound came from an old air cooler positioned near where I was studying. That cooler had been in our house for years. It wasn't exactly quiet. Whenever it ran, it produced a constant humming and rattling sound. Most of the time, nobody paid attention to it because we were so used to hearing it. I was sitting on the couch with my books spread out around me. The hours passed slowly. Eventually, it became quite late. The kind of late where the world feels different. When every sound seems louder than normal. When your eyes feel tired from studying. When even familiar places feel slightly unfamiliar. As I continued reading, I suddenly thought I heard someone say my name. It was faint, so faint that I almost ignored it. At first, I assumed it was nothing. Maybe I had misheard something. Maybe my tired brain was playing tricks on me. I returned to studying. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it seemed clearer. It sounded like someone calling my name, not shouting, not whispering, just calling it. I looked around the room. Nobody was there. The lounge was empty. The hallway was empty. The entire house was quiet. I immediately told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the cooler was producing strange sounds. Machines sometimes create patterns that our brains interpret as voices. It happens more often than people realize. That explanation seemed reasonable enough, so I tried to ignore it. Then it happened again, and this time it sounded even clearer. The voice seemed closer, more distinct, more real. I stopped studying completely. My attention was now focused entirely on that sound. I sat there listening, waiting, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Then once again I heard what sounded like my name. The hairs on my arms stood up. A feeling of unease settled over me. I kept trying to convince myself it was the air cooler. It had to be. There was nothing else in the room capable of making noise. The cooler was old. It rattled. It hummed. Maybe the sound was creating some kind of illusion. Determined to prove it to myself, I stood up and switched the cooler off. The room instantly became quieter. The humming disappeared. The rattling stopped. For a brief moment, I felt relieved. Then I heard it again, and this time it seemed louder than before. Much louder. The moment the cooler stopped, the voice became impossible for me to ignore. It sounded clear enough that I felt someone was actually there, calling my name, over and over. At that point, all logic disappeared. I was terrified, absolutely terrified. My heart started racing. Every instinct inside me screamed that something was wrong. I jumped off the couch and ran. I didn't stop to investigate. I didn't stop to think. I simply ran as fast as I could to my sister's room. By the time I reached her, I was shaking. I could barely speak properly. I was crying and trying to explain what had happened. My sister looked completely shocked. She had never seen me react that way before. I wasn't known for being overly emotional or easily frightened, so seeing me standing there trembling immediately got her attention. Once I managed to calm down enough to explain, she listened carefully. Then she decided to check for herself. She walked back to the lounge while I stayed behind. I remember sitting there nervously waiting. Part of me hoped she would hear the voice too. At least then I would know I wasn't imagining it. A few minutes later, she returned. She looked confused. She told me she hadn't heard anything. Not a voice, not a whisper, nothing unusual at all. That somehow made everything feel worse. If she had heard it too, there would have been an explanation to find. But she heard nothing. Meanwhile, I knew exactly what I had experienced. I knew what I heard. The fear I felt had been completely real. My sister could tell I wasn't making it up. She knew me well enough to understand that I wasn't the type of person to invent stories or create drama for attention. Seeing how shaken I still was, she suggested we pray. At that moment, I was willing to do anything that might calm me down. So we sat together and prayed. Slowly, my breathing returned to normal. The panic began to fade. The overwhelming fear started to loosen its grip. Eventually, I felt calm enough to return to normal. And strangely, after that, the voice never returned. The rest of the night passed quietly. Nothing else happened. The next morning, everything felt normal again. The house looked the same. The lounge looked the same. The old air cooler looked exactly as it always had. Yet I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Years have passed since that night. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand it. Maybe exhaustion played a role. Maybe stress from exams affected me. Maybe there was some sound that my brain interpreted as a voice. Maybe there is a perfectly reasonable explanation that I simply haven't figured out. But no matter how much I think about it, one thing never changes: the memory of how real it felt. I can still remember sitting alone in that quiet lounge. I can still remember hearing my name. I can still remember switching off the cooler and expecting the sound to disappear. And I can still remember the terror I felt when it seemed to become even clearer. I've never experienced anything like it before. I've never experienced anything like it since. Whatever happened that night remains one of the few moments in my life that I genuinely cannot explain. And sometimes, late at night, when a house becomes too quiet, I find myself remembering that voice all over again. I have a friend who seems to attract unusual situations wherever she goes. She's one of those people who always has a ridiculous story to tell. The kind of person whose life somehow becomes a magnet for strange adventures, unexpected encounters, and bizarre coincidences. Honestly, half the reason I enjoy spending time with her is because there's always some unbelievable story waiting to be told. Most of them are funny. This one wasn't. In fact, it's probably the most disturbing thing that has ever happened to someone I know personally. At the time, my friend was around 20 years old. In our area, the legal drinking age is 19, so spending an evening at a bar with friends was nothing unusual. It had been a normal night. Nothing dramatic, nothing memorable, just a group of friends enjoying themselves before heading home. As the night wound down, people began saying their goodbyes outside the bar. My friend was standing around chatting with a few people when something happened that nobody expected. A disagreement broke out nearby between two men. At first, it seemed insignificant, just another drunken argument, the kind of thing people witness outside bars all the time. One of the men accused the other of staring at his girlfriend, or maybe talking to her, or maybe simply looking in her direction. The exact reason didn't really matter. It was one of those pointless arguments fueled by alcohol, pride, and bad decisions. People nearby assumed it would end with a few angry words. Instead, it escalated instantly. Without warning, one of the men pulled out a knife. There was no prolonged fight, no dramatic buildup, no chance for anyone to intervene. One moment, they were arguing. The next moment, he stabbed the other man directly in the abdomen. Then he turned and ran, just like that. Gone, the entire incident took only seconds. What made it even more shocking was where it happened. This wasn't a dangerous neighborhood. It wasn't an area known for violence. People weren't expecting anything remotely like this. According to my friend, it felt as out of place as someone pulling a knife in the middle of a shopping mall food court. For a few seconds, everyone simply froze. When something horrific happens unexpectedly, the human brain sometimes struggles to process it. People stare. People hesitate. People try to understand what they've just seen. My friend later said that she doesn't really remember making a conscious decision to help. She simply reacted. Fortunately, she had received some basic first aid training in the past. Nothing extensive, just enough to understand what needed to be done in an emergency. Until that night, She'd never actually had to use any of it. Suddenly, she found herself kneeling beside a critically injured stranger. The man was bleeding heavily. People around them were panicking. Some were shouting. Others were backing away in shock. Meanwhile, my friend somehow shifted into survival mode. She immediately began applying pressure to the wound. She talked to him continuously, trying to keep him focused and conscious. She instructed bystanders to call emergency services. She delegated tasks. She kept people calm. And she stayed with him. Looking back, she doesn't know where that calmness came from. She wasn't a paramedic. She wasn't a nurse. She was just a young woman who happened to know enough first aid to understand that every second mattered. So she focused entirely on the injured man. Nothing else existed. Not the crowd, not the blood, not the fear. Just the immediate goal of keeping him alive until help arrived. Time became strange. People often describe traumatic situations this way. Minutes feel like seconds. Seconds feel like hours. My friend completely lost track of time. Later, she learned she had been helping him for nearly 20 minutes. To her, it felt much shorter. She just remembers maintaining pressure, talking to him, and hoping the ambulance would arrive before it was too late. Eventually, emergency vehicles appeared. The flashing lights reflected off nearby buildings. Paramedics rushed onto the scene, and only then did something inside her seem to switch off. The professionals had arrived. The responsibility was no longer hers. As the paramedics took over, she simply stood up. She didn't say much. She didn't wait for thanks. She didn't stick around to watch what happened next. She quietly walked away from the scene and sat down on a nearby bench. Only then did she realize what she looked like. Her clothes were covered in blood. Her hands were covered in blood. A stranger's blood. The adrenaline that had carried her through the emergency suddenly disappeared. And reality hit. The shock arrived all at once. She sat on that bench, staring into space, unable to process what had happened, unable to think clearly, unable to move. She remained there for roughly half an hour. People passed by. Police worked the scene. Paramedics continued treating the victim. Meanwhile, she sat frozen. The human body sometimes reacts to trauma in strange ways. For 20 minutes, she had functioned perfectly under pressure. Now that the danger had passed, her mind seemed unable to catch up. Fortunately, someone noticed. After stabilizing the injured man and preparing him for transport, some of the paramedics realized that my friend wasn't doing well. Even though she wasn't physically injured, they understood she had experienced a traumatic event. They approached her. They checked on her. One of them brought her a blanket. Another sat down and talked with her. They asked if she was okay. They made sure she had friends nearby. They wanted to know how she planned to get home. Most importantly, they treated her with the same compassion they had shown the stabbing victim. They recognized that trauma doesn't always leave visible wounds. Eventually, her friends helped her home. The victim survived. The immediate crisis ended. And in the grand scheme of things, the story had a far better ending than it easily could have. But that doesn't make it any less horrifying. What has always stuck with me isn't just the violence itself. It's how quickly ordinary life can become something completely different. One moment, my friend was standing outside a bar saying goodbye to her friends. The next moment, she was kneeling in the street trying to save a dying man. There was no warning, no build-up, no indication that the night was about to change forever. And while she rarely talks about the emotional impact now, I know it affected her. You don't spend 20 minutes holding pressure on a life-threatening wound while someone fights to stay conscious and simply forget about it afterward. Those experiences stay with you. The sounds, the sights, the smell of blood, the feeling of helplessness, the knowledge that someone's life may depend on what you do in the next few moments. Most people never expect to face that situation. My friend certainly didn't. Yet when it happened, she stepped in and did everything she could. That's what impresses me most about the story. Not the violence, not the chaos, but the fact that an ordinary 20-year-old woman found herself in an unimaginable situation and somehow managed to keep another human being alive until help arrived. Even now, years later, whenever people talk about courage, I think of that night. Because real courage rarely looks dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a terrified young woman kneeling on a sidewalk, covered in blood, refusing to give up on a stranger she had never met. And while she has plenty of funny stories from her life, this is the one story that nobody laughs at when she tells it. Out of all the disturbing, creepy, and downright terrifying experiences I've had, this is the one that always comes to mind first. At the time, I was a sophomore in college. Like a lot of college students with too much curiosity and not enough common sense, my friends and I were obsessed with urban exploration. We were always searching for abandoned buildings, forgotten locations, and places most people avoided. We had already explored quite a few interesting places, so when rumors started circulating about an abandoned town hidden in the foothills outside the city, our interest was immediately sparked. An abandoned town? That sounded too good to pass up. According to the stories we'd heard, the place had been deserted for years. Some people claimed it had once housed workers for a nearby industry. Others said it was abandoned after a series of problems nobody could quite explain. Like most urban legends, nobody seemed to know the full story. Naturally, that only made us want to see it more. One night, my two friends and I decided to go. We packed flashlights, wore dark clothing, grabbed some water, and headed out. By the time we arrived, it was around 11:30 at night. The area was isolated and incredibly quiet. Anyone who has ever gone urban exploring knows one important rule: never park directly next to where you're going. If security, police, or property owners happen to show up, a car sitting nearby is the first thing they'll notice. So we parked well away from the location and started walking. The road leading toward the abandoned town was long, dark, and completely deserted. No traffic, no streetlights, no houses, just silence. The farther we walked, the more isolated the area felt. Eventually, we reached a large fence. Beyond it, hidden in the darkness, we could make out faint outlines of buildings. At first, they looked small and unimpressive, just a few structures barely visible against the night sky. The entire area was fenced off, and finding a way inside became our next challenge. We had been told there was a hidden entrance somewhere along the side of a nearby hill. Supposedly, someone had cut a hole in the fence years earlier. The landmark we were given was simple: find the red house. Across from it would be the path leading up the hill. Sounds easy enough. It wasn't. We spent quite a while wandering around before finally spotting a red house that matched the description. Assuming it was the correct one, we began climbing through thick brush and tangled vegetation. Branches grabbed at our clothes. Loose dirt slid beneath our feet. The climb was steep and exhausting. Several times we nearly lost our footing. Eventually, we found it. A crude opening cut into the iron fence. It looked as though someone had taken a saw to the metal years earlier. The opening was small enough that we had to squeeze through sideways. One wrong move, and you risked sliding down the hillside. We pushed ourselves through the gap, brushed dirt from our clothes, and finally looked up. The sight stopped us cold. This wasn't just a collection of abandoned buildings, it was an entire town. Streets stretched into the darkness. Rows of houses sat empty and silent. There was what appeared to be a market center, an apartment complex. small neighborhoods branching off in different directions. The place looked frozen in time. For a moment, excitement replaced caution. We couldn't believe what we were seeing. With flashlights in hand, we started exploring. The apartment complex seemed like the best place to begin. As we approached, I heard something. A faint sound. Beep, I paused. Did you hear that? My friends looked around. Beep, there it was again. The sound was quiet but unmistakable. None of us could determine where it was coming from. It didn't seem important, so we continued walking. Inside one of the apartment units, we found signs that people had been there before. An old mattress, random belongings, discarded trash. Nothing particularly shocking for an abandoned location. Still, the beeping continued. Beep, 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 always subtle, always somewhere nearby. We moved into another apartment. The moment we opened the door, the atmosphere changed. The living room was filled with black trench coats. Some hung neatly, others were piled on the floor. At first we thought it was strange. Then we realized just how strange it actually was. Why would an abandoned apartment contain so many coats? And who had left them there? The discovery unsettled us, but curiosity pushed us forward. We continued exploring. Upstairs we found a locked door, completely locked. Unlike the rest of the building, which had been left open and accessible. For some reason, that locked door bothered me more than anything else. Someone had made a conscious effort to keep people out. We didn't try forcing it. None of us wanted to know what might be behind it. Instead, we quietly left the apartment. By now, the beeping seemed more frequent. Not just one beep, several, coming from different directions. We began noticing something else. Whenever we approached certain buildings, the sounds became faster and louder. Move closer. Beep, beep, beep. Move away. The sound faded. The realization made us uncomfortable. It felt almost as though something was responding to our movements. Of course, there were probably rational explanations. Security devices, motion sensors, abandoned electronics. But at that moment, standing in a deserted town after midnight, rational explanations weren't exactly our first thought. A growing feeling settled over us, the feeling that we weren't alone. The sensation was impossible to shake. Every empty window seemed to be watching. Every dark doorway felt occupied. The entire town suddenly seemed less abandoned than we had assumed. Then we found the house. It was an old white house sitting by itself. Weathered, rotting, the kind of place horror movies are built around. What caught our attention wasn't the house itself. It was the front yard. Leading directly to the front door was a carefully arranged path of shattered glass. The broken pieces had been organized into neat square formations, not scattered, not random. Deliberate, someone had placed them there. We stopped. Nobody said anything. The sight instantly triggered alarm bells. Abandoned places don't organize themselves. Someone had done that. Someone had been there recently. As we stood staring at the strange arrangement, trying to decide whether investigating further was a terrible idea, something happened. A bright beam of light exploded from an upstairs window. It hit us directly. For a split second, we froze. The light was powerful, blinding. Then the beeping around us suddenly accelerated. Beep, 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 louder, faster, coming from multiple directions. Every instinct screamed the same message. Run. We didn't argue. We didn't discuss it. We turned and ran. As we sprinted through the abandoned streets, more lights appeared, one after another. Flashlight beams burst from buildings all around us. Windows lit up. Doorways flashed. Powerful beams swept across the streets. It felt as though invisible eyes had suddenly opened throughout the entire town. Our shadows stretched across the pavement as the lights tracked our movements. Everywhere we ran, Another beam seemed to find us. The town that had felt empty moments earlier suddenly felt populated. Occupied, watching, hunting. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might explode. The sound of our footsteps echoed through the streets. Nobody looked back. Nobody wanted to see who or what might be following us. At one point, my friend fell hard. For a terrifying second, I thought he was done for. But adrenaline got him back on his feet immediately. He kept running. We all did. The biggest problem was that none of us were completely sure where the exit was. The streets looked different in the dark. Panic made everything worse. Fortunately, the friend leading the way remembered the route. Then, through the darkness, I spotted it. The hole in the fence. Our escape. My first friend dove through. The second squeezed under. I stopped long enough to help him get clear. Even though I never looked back, I could see flashes of light bouncing around behind me. They were moving. Approaching, whether someone was actually chasing us or not, it certainly felt that way. The moment my friend cleared the fence, I dropped to the ground and crawled through the opening. Then I slid down the hillside. Branches tore at my clothes. Thorns scratched my skin. I barely noticed. All I cared about was getting away. We ran the entire way down the road. The darkness felt deeper than before. The silence felt heavier. Finally, in the distance, we saw our car. None of us slowed down until we were inside with the doors locked. Only then did we stop. Breathing hard, sweating, trying to understand what had just happened. As we drove away, the mysterious beeping gradually faded into the distance. For weeks afterward, we talked about that night. We couldn't explain the lights. We couldn't explain the beeping. We couldn't explain the trench coats. And we definitely couldn't explain the shattered glass arranged in front of that house. 3 months later, curiosity got the better of us. We returned. This time, however, everything had changed. The fence was gone. The town was gone. Bulldozers and construction crews occupied the area. Nearly every building had been demolished. It was as if the entire place had been erased. We spoke with one of the workers and asked what had happened. His answers sent a chill through all of us. According to him, the abandoned town had become a major hub for criminal activity. Gangs, drug trafficking, violent crime, even murders. Apparently, the area had developed such a dangerous reputation that the city eventually decided demolition was the only solution. Standing there, looking at the rubble, a lot of things suddenly made more sense. The beeping, the lights, the occupied buildings, the feeling of being watched, the possibility that we had wandered into territory we were never supposed to see. Maybe nobody intended to kill us. Maybe they simply wanted us gone. Or maybe we were much closer to real danger than we'll ever know. To this day, I still think about that abandoned town. Not because of ghosts, not because of paranormal activity, but because sometimes the scariest places aren't haunted at all. Sometimes they're occupied by very real people, hiding in the dark. And sometimes that's far more terrifying. For as long as I can remember, I was terrified of water. Not the normal kind of childhood fear where a kid is nervous about swimming or doesn't like getting water in their eyes. This was something much deeper, something that seemed completely irrational to everyone around me. When I was little, even the sight of water could send me into a panic. Bath time was a nightmare. My foster parents would try everything they could think of to calm me down, but the moment I realized I was about to be put in a bathtub, I would completely lose control. I would scream until my throat was raw. I would cry so hard I could barely breathe. Sometimes I would fight with every ounce of strength I had just to avoid getting into the water. As I got older, the fear never went away. Other kids looked forward to pool parties during the summer. I dreaded them. If a classmate invited me to a birthday party at a swimming pool, I would find any excuse possible not to go. If there was no way to avoid it, I would spend the entire time as far away from the water as possible. Even small things terrified me. A lake, a pond, a public swimming pool. Sometimes even a large puddle after a rainstorm was enough to make me uncomfortable. The fear was overwhelming, and the worst part was that I had no idea why. I constantly asked questions. Why was I so afraid? Had something happened to me when I was little? Did anyone know where the fear came from? Every time I asked, I got the same vague answers. People would tell me not to worry about it. They would change the subject, or they would simply say they didn't know. As a child, that only made things more frustrating. I felt like everyone knew something that I didn't. Years passed. The fear remained. I learned how to hide it better as I got older, but it never truly disappeared. Then came my 17th birthday. By that point, I had become fairly good at avoiding situations involving water. Most of my friends knew I didn't like swimming and generally didn't push the issue. One friend, however, didn't really understand how serious the fear was. She invited me to a birthday gathering at her apartment complex. I agreed to go. When I arrived, I immediately noticed something that made me uneasy. The party was taking place right next to the apartment pool. Just seeing the water made me uncomfortable. I tried to ignore it. I told myself everything would be fine. I wasn't planning on getting anywhere near the pool anyway. For a while, things were normal. People were talking, laughing, and hanging out. Then everything changed in an instant. Without warning, the friend who had invited me grabbed me and shoved me into the pool. To her, it was probably meant as a harmless joke, the kind of thing people do at pool parties all the time. The moment I hit the water, I completely lost control. I didn't react like a normal person who had been unexpectedly pushed into a pool. I reacted like someone living through a nightmare. The panic was immediate and overwhelming. I started screaming. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Every part of me was consumed by terror. I remember crying uncontrollably, hyperventilating, thrashing. At one point I was so frightened that I nearly lost control of my bladder. The people around me had no idea what was happening. Some thought I was joking. Others thought I was angry. Nobody understood that I was genuinely terrified. Fortunately, my boyfriend realized something was seriously wrong. He pulled me out of the water and got me away from the pool. Meanwhile, the friend who had pushed me in was horrified. She immediately started apologizing, over and over again. The moment she realized how badly I was reacting, she understood that this wasn't a prank gone wrong. This was something much deeper. I couldn't stay. I left the party and went home. By the time I got there, I was still shaking. I felt exhausted, embarrassed, and emotionally drained. My foster dad sat with me for a long time. He wrapped his arms around me and let me calm down. Neither of us spoke much at first. I was just grateful to be away from the water. Grateful to be somewhere safe. Slowly, my breathing returned to normal. The panic began to fade. We sat there quietly for a while. Then my foster dad said something. His tone was different, serious, careful, like someone preparing to reveal a secret they had kept for a very long time. "There's something I need to tell you." I looked up at him. The expression on his face immediately told me this wasn't going to be an ordinary conversation. For a moment, he seemed unsure of how to begin. Then he finally spoke. "You were placed into foster care because your mother tried to kill you." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I stared at him, unable to respond. Part of me wondered if I had heard him correctly. Surely I hadn't. Surely he hadn't just said that. But he continued. "When you were a baby, Your mother filled a bathtub with water and held you under. The room felt suddenly smaller. Every sound around me seemed to disappear. I could hear only his voice. He explained that my father had discovered what was happening and stopped her. If he hadn't arrived when he did, I likely would not have survived. I sat frozen, trying to process what I was hearing. Then came the part that disturbed me most, the reason she gave. When people questioned her afterward, they wanted to know why she had done it, why she would try to drown her own child. According to my foster father, her answer was chilling. She said she didn't like the way I looked at my father. At first, the statement made no sense. Then he explained further. My mother was intensely jealous, unhealthily jealous. She believed I looked at my father with affection, attention, love, and in her mind that was somehow threatening. According to what she told authorities, she claimed I was looking at her with the same eyes while she held me underwater. Even now, years later, those words are difficult to comprehend. I was an infant, a baby, yet somehow, in her disturbed state of mind, she saw me as competition, as a threat, as someone she needed to remove. For a long time after that conversation, I sat in silence. My entire life suddenly seemed different. All those years, all that fear, all those unexplained panic attacks around water, the terror I felt whenever I saw a pool, a lake, or even a bathtub, the screaming, the nightmares, the overwhelming sense of dread I had never been able to explain. For the first time, it made sense. Somewhere deep inside me, a memory remained, not a conscious memory. I couldn't remember the event itself. I couldn't picture it. But my body remembered. My mind remembered. Even if I didn't understand why. Every time I encountered water, some hidden part of me reacted as though I were in danger, as though I were fighting for my life. The realization was heartbreaking, but it was also strangely freeing. For years, I had believed there was something wrong with me, something irrational, something broken. Now I finally understood that my fear had come from somewhere. It had a reason, a terrible reason, but a reason nonetheless. I wish I could say that learning the truth instantly fixed everything. It didn't. Trauma doesn't work that way. The fear didn't magically disappear. The memories I never consciously had didn't suddenly lose their power. But at least I finally understood why. The mystery that had haunted me my entire life was gone. What remained was the difficult process of accepting the truth that before I was old enough to form memories, someone who should have protected me tried to take my life. And the truth that even though I couldn't consciously remember that day, some part of me had been carrying it ever since. For 17 years, I thought I was simply afraid of water. What I eventually learned was far more disturbing. I wasn't afraid of water. I was afraid of what had happened to me in it. This is a story I've wanted to share for a long time. Even after all these years, thinking about it still gives me chills. Whether people believe it or not doesn't really matter to me anymore. I lived it, and the events that unfolded changed the way I look at life forever. To understand what happened, I need to start a few years earlier. When I was 19 years old, I met a young woman and we quickly fell in love. Like many young couples, we had dreams bigger than our bank accounts. We built a life together, and over time we had 2 beautiful daughters. Money was always tight, but we made it work. My girlfriend was of native background and had moved off the reserve to live in the city with me. Despite the struggles, we were a family, and we did our best to create a good life for our children. In 2005, we were renting a small house and raising our daughters together when her youngest brother, Clinton, came to stay with us for a couple of weeks. Clinton was 16 years old. He was a genuinely good kid, polite, respectful, and easy to get along with. He wasn't the type to cause trouble, and everyone who knew him seemed to like him. One night, while everyone in the house was asleep, something strange happened. I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I realized I was hearing sounds coming from the living room where Clinton was sleeping on the couch. The noises were unlike anything I had ever heard before. Concerned, I got up and quietly walked into the living room. Clinton was still asleep. At least he appeared to be. But while sleeping, he had sat upright on the couch. His eyes were closed, and he was making sounds. Not talking, not mumbling. Howling. The best way I can describe it is that he sounded like a wolf. The noises were raw, primitive, and deeply unsettling. I had never heard anything like it come from another human being. For several moments I simply stood there listening. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Clinton lay back down and continued sleeping. I eventually convinced myself he was just having an unusual dream and went back to bed. A few days later, Clinton surprised all of us. He invited our entire family out for dinner at the Keg. For anyone unfamiliar with it, it wasn't exactly the kind of restaurant you'd expect a 16-year-old kid to be paying for. It was expensive. As we sat there eating, I remember repeatedly thinking how odd it was. Clinton wasn't wealthy, yet here he was treating all of us to dinner. At the time, I simply thought it was a kind gesture. Looking back, it feels different, almost like he was saying goodbye. The next morning, everything changed. When my girlfriend and I woke up, Clinton was gone. At first, we assumed he had left early. Then the phone rang. The call shattered everything. Clinton had been killed in a car accident while traveling back to the reserve. I remember the feeling of disbelief, the confusion, the shock. One moment he had been sitting across from us at dinner. The next, he was gone forever. Our entire household was devastated. As the reality settled in, I couldn't stop thinking about the night he had sat upright in his sleep and howled. The memory kept returning, over and over again. I began wondering if what I had witnessed was somehow connected to what was coming, whether it was his spirit beginning to leave, whether he somehow knew his time was short. I don't know. All I know is that the thought never left me. Neither did the memory of that dinner. It felt strangely significant afterward, as though Clinton had known something the rest of us didn't. His funeral was heartbreaking. Family members came from all over to pay their respects. Among them was his older brother, Joe. Joe was struggling badly. Throughout the service, he broke down repeatedly. The grief seemed almost unbearable for him. After the funeral ended, he wrapped his arms around Clinton's headstone and refused to let go. Family members eventually had to persuade him to leave. Later that evening, a traditional gathering was held around a fire to honor Clinton's memory. People sat together sharing stories and remembering the young man they had lost. As I sat there listening, my attention drifted upward. A single black crow was circling above the fire, round and round, over and over again. What struck me was how alone it was. The sky was otherwise empty. No other birds, no movement, just that lone black crow circling above us. I remember feeling unsettled by it, though I couldn't explain why. Life moved forward, but the family never truly recovered from losing Clinton. Then, tragedy struck again. About a month later, my girlfriend and I were back home when the phone rang. This time it was news about Joe. He had been killed. Another car accident, near the reserve, the same way his younger brother had died. The devastation that news caused is difficult to describe. The family had barely begun grieving one loss when another arrived. At Joe's funeral, I couldn't help noticing similarities. This time, my girlfriend found herself standing beside the headstone, struggling to walk away just as Joe had done at Clinton's funeral. The grief seemed to be repeating itself. Later, another memorial fire was held. Again, family members gathered. Again, stories were shared. And once again, I found myself looking toward the sky. This time, There were two black birds circling above the fire. Not one, two. I stared at them for a long time. The rest of the sky remained empty. Only those two birds moved overhead. And for the first time, a strange feeling settled over me. A feeling I couldn't shake. Two brothers. Two birds. The thought lingered long after the fire ended. A few months later, something happened that frightened my girlfriend deeply. One morning she woke up shaken. She told me she had dreamed that our house burned down and that everyone inside died. She had always been somewhat superstitious and had begun believing there was a curse hanging over the family after everything that had happened. The dream terrified her, so much so that she packed up the children and decided to stay with a friend for a few days. At the time, I thought she was overreacting. I stayed behind. One evening, while she was away, I ran into an old high school friend named Tim. We both loved music, and before long we decided to spend the night jamming at my place. Hours passed. We played music, talked, laughed, and eventually called it a night. Tim went home. I fell asleep on the couch. The next morning I headed to work. About an hour after arriving, my phone rang. My house was on fire. I raced back as quickly as I could. When I arrived, the scene looked unreal. Police tape surrounded the property. Fire trucks lined the street. My home was gone, completely destroyed, burned nearly to the ground. Standing there staring at the remains, one thought kept repeating in my mind. If my girlfriend and daughters had been there, they would almost certainly have died. The realization left me shaken. It felt impossible to ignore the connection to her dream. Eventually, life moved on again. Not long after, my girlfriend and I separated. I received custody of our daughters. She moved back to the reserve to be closer to her family. Years passed. I eventually met someone new and remarried. My daughters lived with me and my new wife while visiting their mother on weekends and holidays. Then Christmas of 2007 arrived. A few days before the holiday, my ex-girlfriend called to ask if she could have the children for Christmas break. She was at work when she called. The conversation itself wasn't unusual, but something about her voice stood out. Even now I can hear it. There was a sadness there, a shakiness, something I couldn't quite identify. At the time, I brushed it aside. An hour later, the phone rang again. This time, it was her sister. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. My ex-girlfriend had been killed in a car accident on her way home from work. She wasn't wearing a seatbelt. She was the only person in the vehicle who died. I remember feeling numb, completely numb. The following day, I had to sit down with my daughters and tell them their mother was gone. No parent should ever have to deliver news like that. To this day, it remains the hardest conversation I have ever had. At her funeral, as I prepared to leave the reserve, a strange feeling came over me. It was sudden and powerful. I knew exactly what I expected to see. Slowly, I looked toward the sky. 3 black birds were circling overhead. 3, at that moment, an incredible sense of peace washed over me. I thought of Clinton. I thought of Joe. And I thought of her. For reasons I still can't fully explain, it felt as though they were together. The years that followed included a lengthy court case against the drunk driver responsible for the crash. Local newspapers covered the trial extensively. One evening, my new wife and I were discussing one of the articles while lying in bed. I expressed frustration about the case and concern for my daughters. At one point, my wife made an offhand remark. "I don't know why you care so much," she said. "Your ex-girlfriend was a bitch to you." The comment bothered me, not because our relationship had been perfect, it certainly hadn't been, but because she was still the mother of my children. The next morning, I walked outside to leave for work and stopped dead in my tracks. My car was covered in bird droppings. Not a few spots, not a handful. The entire vehicle. It looked as though dozens of birds had targeted it. The windshield, the roof, the doors, everything. I stood there staring in disbelief. There were no large trees nearby. Birds rarely gathered around our house. None of the neighboring vehicles looked anything like mine. Yet somehow my car looked as though 50 birds had chosen it specifically. I couldn't help but laugh. For the first time in a long time, the thought didn't scare me. Instead, it felt strangely familiar, like a message, a reminder. Whether people believe these events were connected or simply a series of coincidences doesn't really matter. I've spent years reflecting on everything that happened. The howling in the night, the final dinner, the dreams, the fires, the funerals, the birds. Individually, perhaps each event has a logical explanation. Together, they form a story that changed the way I see the world. Even now, whenever I see black birds circling overhead, I stop and watch. Because to me, they'll never be just birds again. They'll always remind me of a family, a series of tragedies, and a year that forever changed my life. This happened when I was around 7 or 8 years old, and even though it wasn't the most dramatic thing that's ever happened to me, it scared me enough that I still remember it clearly years later. It started as a completely normal evening. My sister and I were downstairs watching television long after we probably should have been in bed. For some reason, I had a sleeping bag with me while we were watching TV. I don't remember exactly why, but at that age I loved anything that felt like camping or a sleepover, even if it was just in my own house. Eventually, both of us started getting tired. The house was quiet, the television was becoming harder to focus on, and it was obvious that bedtime had finally won. We turned everything off and headed upstairs. Before going to bed, I grabbed the sleeping bag and took it with me because I had decided I wanted to sleep in it on top of my bed. To a kid, that seemed like the greatest idea ever. I climbed into bed, settled into the sleeping bag, and quickly drifted off to sleep. I don't know how much time passed before I woke up. At first, I wasn't even fully awake. What pulled me out of sleep was a sudden impact on my mattress. The best way I can describe it is that it felt like someone had punched or slapped the bed right next to my face. Not hard enough to hurt me, just hard enough to wake me up. I opened my eyes slightly and looked around. The room was dark and quiet. Nothing seemed unusual. Being half asleep, I didn't spend much time thinking about it. I assumed I had imagined it or that maybe I'd been dreaming. So I rolled over, closed my eyes, and tried to go back to sleep. A few moments later, it happened again. This time it was much stronger, much more deliberate. It felt as though something had struck the mattress right beside my head with enough force to make the bed move. The sensation instantly woke me up. Every trace of sleep vanished. I sat upright and stared into the darkness. My heart started racing. I listened carefully. Nothing. The house was silent. No footsteps, no voices, no sounds at all. Yet I knew I hadn't imagined that second impact. It had felt too real, too forceful. As a child, my imagination immediately began working against me. Every shadow in the room suddenly seemed threatening. Every dark corner felt occupied. The fear hit me all at once. I jumped out of bed and ran straight down the hallway to my sister's room. I remember bursting through the door and immediately telling her what had happened. Still, half asleep, she wasn't impressed. She told me I was being ridiculous. She assumed I'd had a bad dream or that I was just trying to avoid sleeping alone, but I was genuinely terrified. I kept insisting that something had hit my bed. Twice, the second time it felt like whatever it was had been trying to wake me up. Eventually, after enough pleading, my sister agreed to let me stay in her room. She had another bed in there, and I practically dove into it. Even though she thought I was overreacting, simply being in the same room as someone else made me feel safer. For a while, everything was quiet. The fear slowly started to fade. I remember thinking that maybe my sister was right. Maybe it had been a dream. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Then we heard it, a loud crash. The noise came from the direction of my bedroom. Both of us froze. The sound was impossible to ignore. It wasn't a small noise. It was a sudden, heavy bang that echoed through the hallway. Now even my sister looked concerned. We sat there listening. The house returned to silence. Eventually, when we finally worked up the courage to investigate, we discovered that all of the posters hanging in my room had fallen down. Not just one, all of them, at the same time. There were also several large trash bags sitting outside my bedroom door that had somehow been knocked over as well. As kids, we had no explanation for it. Maybe there was a perfectly normal reason. Maybe the adhesive holding the posters had finally given out. Maybe something shifted and caused the bags to fall. Looking back as an adult, there are plenty of possible explanations. But at the time, none of that mattered. All I knew was that something had seemingly hit my mattress twice while I was sleeping. I had run out of the room in fear, and shortly afterward, we heard a loud crash coming from the exact room I had fled. For a 7 or 8-year-old kid, that was more than enough to convince me that something strange had happened. I didn't care what anyone said. There was no chance I was sleeping in that room again anytime soon. In fact, I refused to sleep there for nearly a week. Every night after that, I found some excuse to sleep somewhere else. Whether it was in my sister's room, on a couch, or anywhere that wasn't my bedroom, I wanted nothing to do with that room after dark. Even now, years later, I can still remember the feeling of that impact beside my face. The sudden jolt awake. The second, harder strike. The rush of fear. And the loud crash that came afterward. Maybe there was a completely logical explanation for everything. Maybe there wasn't. But when you're a child, lying alone in a dark room, and something seems to hit your bed hard enough to wake you up twice, logic isn't usually the first thing that comes to mind. Fear is. And that night, I was absolutely terrified. I grew up in a very small town in Florida. When I say small, I mean the kind of place where everyone seems to know everyone else. During the winter months, the population practically doubled when retirees from northern states came down to escape the cold. Outside of that season, the town felt almost empty. At night, it became even quieter. There weren't many businesses open late, and after around 9:30 or 10 p.m., the roads were usually deserted. Streetlights were limited, and large stretches of road disappeared into darkness. If you saw another vehicle late at night, it was often the same people you saw every day. When I was 16, I had a boyfriend who lived across town in a lower-income neighborhood. Since he didn't have a driver's license yet, I was usually the one making the trip to see him. Most Friday and Saturday nights followed the same routine. I'd spend the evening at his house and then drive home later that night. The trip wasn't especially long, maybe 15 minutes or so, but it took me through some very quiet parts of town. One Saturday night, I left his house around 10 or 10:30 p.m. Everything seemed completely normal at first. As I turned onto the main road, I noticed a pickup truck pass by. That alone wasn't unusual enough to raise concern, but it did stand out because there simply weren't many vehicles on the road at that hour. Still, I didn't think much of it. I continued driving. A few minutes later, I realized I was still seeing the same truck. At first, I assumed it was heading somewhere nearby. After all, people occasionally traveled the same route, but the longer I drove, the more aware I became of its presence. The truck remained behind me, not particularly close, not aggressively, just there, following the same turns, taking the same roads, maintaining roughly the same distance. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping into my mind. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was a small town. Maybe the driver simply happened to be heading in the same direction. But something felt off. The truck seemed to be moving unusually slowly, almost as though the driver wasn't in any hurry to get where he was going. And for some reason, I had the strange impression that he was paying attention to me. The feeling grew stronger with every mile. Eventually, I convinced myself the easiest way to prove I was imagining things would be to pass him. If I got ahead and he continued on his own way, then I'd know there was nothing to worry about. So when I had the opportunity, I accelerated and moved past the truck. As I did, I glanced over. That was when the situation stopped feeling normal. The driver was a middle-aged man, and he was staring directly at me. Not casually, not the quick glance people exchange when passing another car. He was staring intensely, his eyes locked onto mine. The expression on his face is something I still remember years later. It wasn't anger, it wasn't confusion. It was something much harder to describe. There was an intensity in his gaze that instantly made my stomach drop. The moment our eyes met, every alarm bell in my head started going off. I was 16 years old, alone, driving home at night. And there was something about the way that man looked at me that genuinely frightened me. For the first time, I stopped trying to convince myself I was imagining things. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Without hesitation, I reached for my phone and called my dad. Thankfully, he answered. The second I heard his voice, I felt slightly better. I told him what was happening and asked him to stay on the phone with me until I got home. As we talked, I kept checking my mirrors. The truck was still there, still behind me, still following the same route. At that point, the coincidence explanation was becoming harder and harder to believe. The area where my boyfriend lived was on one side of town. My parents lived on the opposite side. There weren't many reasons for someone to make that exact trip at that time of night. Yet there he was, still behind me. I tried to focus on my conversation with my dad, but my attention kept drifting back to the truck. Every turn I made, it seemed to make as well. Every mile I drove, it remained there. The closer I got to home, the more nervous I became. Eventually, I reached my neighborhood. As I slowed down to make the turn, I looked back again. The truck had stopped on the main road, not far away, close enough to clearly see where I was turning, close enough to watch. The sight immediately sent a surge of panic through me. I don't remember every detail after that. I just remember fear, pure fear. I pressed the gas pedal and drove as quickly as I could toward my parents' house. My dad was already outside waiting for me in the driveway. Seeing him standing there was one of the biggest feelings of relief I've ever experienced. I pulled in, jumped out of the car, and hurried toward the house. By then, I wasn't paying attention to much else. I was focused entirely on getting inside. For years afterward, I couldn't remember whether the truck ever turned into our neighborhood or not. The memory had become blurred by panic. Later, I asked my dad if he remembered. To my surprise, he did. According to him, the truck never turned in. It continued driving past our street. On one hand, that should have made me feel better. On the other hand, it left me with even more questions. If the driver wasn't following me, why had he appeared to take the exact same route through town? Why had he stared at me like that? Why had he stopped where he could see the entrance to my neighborhood? Maybe it was all coincidence. Maybe he lived somewhere nearby. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation. I honestly don't know, but what I do know is how it felt. As a 16-year-old girl driving alone on dark, nearly empty roads, something about that man and that truck triggered every instinct telling me to be careful. To this day, I can still picture that moment when I looked over while passing him. The darkness outside, the empty road, and that intense stare. Maybe nothing would have happened. Maybe he was never a threat at all. But sometimes it's not what happens that stays with you. Sometimes it's the feeling that something could have happened. And on that quiet Florida night, that feeling was terrifying enough. During one summer break while I was home from college, I got a job working as a morning cleaner at a local movie theater. At first, it seemed like the perfect summer job. The hours were strange, but the work was easy enough, and I got to spend a lot of time listening to music while working by myself. The theater had been built in the early 1990s and was still relatively new. It was a fairly large complex, with 3 huge screen rooms, 4 medium-sized theaters, and 3 smaller ones. My shift ran from 4 a.m. until 10 a.m., long before the first customers arrived. The theater itself sat in an isolated area on the edge of town. It took me about 20 minutes to drive there each morning, and most of the route passed through empty roads. Before the area had been developed, I was told it had been mostly wetlands, farmland, and property owned by the local nature center. For the first couple of weeks, nothing unusual happened. Most mornings there were only 2 or 3 of us working. We'd spread out across the building and spend hours cleaning auditoriums, sweeping floors, emptying trash, and vacuuming aisles. Because everyone worked in separate areas, you could easily go an hour without seeing another person. I would usually put on my headphones, listen to music, and work my way through the theaters one by one. Then one morning, my manager asked me a strange question. "Have you ever noticed the front doors unlocked when you arrived?" I told him no. He exchanged a glance with another employee and then explained that several customers had been complaining about a strange man inside the theater. According to the reports, women would notice a very tall man following them from theater to theater. Sometimes they claimed he followed them into the hallways leading toward the bathrooms. A few were so frightened that they reported him to management immediately. The descriptions were always nearly identical. A very tall man, thin, dressed entirely in black, wearing a suit and what sounded like a bowler hat. Some witnesses estimated he was close to 7 feet tall. Several people had become so frightened that the police had actually been called. The strange part was that nobody could ever find him. Employees would rush to investigate. Security would search the building. Police officers would check the theaters. Nobody was ever there. The younger employees had even given him a nickname, the Tall Man. Most people treated the stories like a running joke, but there was always something about the way they talked about him that made me think they weren't entirely joking. Sometimes male employees reported seeing him too. They'd catch a glimpse of a tall figure slipping into a theater and assume it was someone sneaking into a movie. By the time they followed him inside, the room would be empty. No sign of anyone, just rows of seats and silence. I didn't think much of it at the time. Every workplace has weird stories. I assumed this was just another one. Then I learned about Theater 5. Out of all 12 auditoriums, Theater 5 had a reputation. Nobody liked cleaning it. Nobody wanted to work there alone. Even my manager seemed uncomfortable whenever the subject came up. The theater sat behind the lobby restrooms, separated from the rest of the building by a long hallway. To reach it, you had to walk farther into the complex than any other auditorium. At 4 in the morning, when the building was dark and mostly empty, that isolation became very noticeable. Employees complained about strange things happening there. Headaches, nosebleeds, feeling watched, anxiety that appeared for no reason. Whenever cleaning assignments were handed out, people would suddenly become very interested in cleaning anywhere except Theater 5. Since I was new and didn't know any better, I usually ended up assigned there. My first strange experience happened in that auditorium. It started as an ordinary morning. I had finished sweeping the lobby and moved on to cleaning Theater 5. Part of the routine involved walking through the rows, collecting abandoned cups, popcorn containers, and trash before vacuuming. I had my headphones on and was working normally when I suddenly became aware of an uncomfortable feeling. The feeling that someone was standing directly behind me. At first I ignored it. Then it happened again and again. Every few minutes I found myself turning around. Nobody was there. The room was empty. The projector wasn't running. The theater was silent. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. Eventually, I even removed my headphones and called out. "Hello?" No answer. Nothing. Feeling a little foolish, I went back to work. About 20 minutes later, I was standing near the back row, sweeping trash from beneath the seats. That's when I heard footsteps. Fast footsteps. Running, I looked up. At the front of the auditorium, I caught sight of a small figure. A little blonde-haired boy. He darted across the front row and disappeared around the corner into the hallway. The sight startled me. My immediate thought was that a child had somehow gotten into the building. I dropped my broom and took off after him. I ran down the hallway, into the lobby. Nothing, no child. No movement. Nobody. Confused, I continued into the main lobby where I spotted my manager, Jeff, outside on a smoke break. "Who was that kid?" I asked. Jeff looked at me blankly for a moment. Then he laughed. It wasn't nervous laughter. It was the laughter of someone who had heard the same question many times before. "Oh," he said casually. "So you met Charlie." That was my introduction to Charlie. Apparently, customers regularly complained about a blonde-haired boy running through Theater 5 during movies. People reported hearing him laughing, running up and down aisles, and creating disturbances. Whenever employees went looking for him, he disappeared. Just like that. Gone. The women working there had nicknamed him Charlie because he supposedly resembled Charlie from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Charlie wasn't considered threatening, just annoying. Employees blamed him whenever garbage cans were knocked over or supplies went missing. More than once, items would disappear only to be found in strange places later. One morning, we even discovered the theater flashlight sitting in a garbage can. The running joke was that Charlie had done it. I laughed along with everyone else, at least until I encountered the tall man. That happened a few weeks later. At that point, I still hadn't heard all the stories. If I had, I probably would have quit immediately. Part of opening the theater each morning involved turning on the lights in every auditorium. To do that, someone had to go upstairs to the projection area. The projector level was always creepy, even during the daytime. It was filled with life-sized cardboard movie displays, massive posters, and dark hallways. At 4 in the morning, it felt like the setting of a horror movie. Normally, we'd carry a flashlight. That morning, I couldn't find it. Later, we'd discover it had somehow ended up in the trash. So I headed upstairs in near darkness. As I walked through the projection corridor, I flipped switches one by one. The only light came from exit signs and computer monitors. The rest was shadows. I had stayed awake most of the night before, watching old episodes of The Andy Griffith Show. Without really thinking about it, I found myself whistling the theme song while I worked. Everything seemed normal. Then I felt it. That same sensation from Theater 5. The feeling that someone was watching me. I stopped walking. The whistling stopped too. Ahead of me, near the projector windows overlooking one of the large theaters, I saw what looked like a cardboard display. There were dozens of them throughout the building. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Then it moved. My entire body froze. The shape wasn't cardboard. It was crouching, hidden in the darkness. As I stared, a slow whistle drifted through the corridor. The same tune I had been whistling moments earlier, the Andy Griffith theme song. Only slower, much slower. The figure began rising from its crouched position, and it just kept rising and rising until it stood fully upright. It was enormous, at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. All I could see was a silhouette outlined by red exit signs behind it. A man, thin, wearing what appeared to be a long dark coat. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then he took a step toward me, still whistling. Slowly, calmly, my mind screamed at me to run. But I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the floor. My mouth was dry. Every instinct told me something was horribly wrong. The figure continued approaching, one slow step after another. His walk seemed unusual. There was a slight limp or awkward sway in his movement. I couldn't tell exactly. I only know that every step felt deliberate. He had taken 3 or 4 steps toward me when something suddenly distracted him. The whistling stopped. He turned his head, then calmly turned his body and walked into an office farther down the corridor. The moment he disappeared from sight, I snapped out of whatever fear had paralyzed me. I turned and ran. I flew down the stairs and out of the building. Then I stood outside waiting for the rest of the morning crew to arrive. When my manager finally showed up, I told him everything, every detail. The silhouette, the whistling, the height, the way it had mimicked me. When I finished, nobody laughed. Nobody looked surprised. They simply nodded, as if I'd finally seen what everyone else already knew about. They told me that was the tall man. The same figure customers had been reporting for years. The same figure employees occasionally glimpsed before he vanished. Then my manager said something I'll never forget. "The tall man exists," he told me, "but he's not going to hurt you." I didn't care whether he was dangerous or not. Seeing him once was enough. I put in my 2 weeks shortly afterward. To this day, I still don't know what I saw in that movie theater. Maybe there was a logical explanation. Maybe there wasn't. All I know is that I spent one summer cleaning an isolated theater at 4 in the morning, and I left convinced that I had encountered something I couldn't explain. And even now, years later, I still avoid empty movie theaters whenever I can. This story didn't happen to me personally. It happened to my older brother and one of his friends, and even decades later, it's still one of the most disturbing stories our family talks about. At the time, my brother was around 18 years old. Like many teenagers, he and his friends thought they were invincible. They loved adventure, hated sitting still, and rarely considered how dangerous some of their ideas actually were. One weekend, they decided to visit a friend who lived in Abbotsford, British Columbia. The problem was that they lived in Port Coquitlam. Instead of finding a ride or taking public transportation, they came up with what seemed like a great idea at the time. They would ride their bicycles there. It was a long journey, but they were young, energetic, and excited about the challenge. The plan was simple: leave Friday afternoon, spend the weekend with their friend, and head home later. They set out around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. According to their estimates, they expected to arrive sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning. It would be a long ride, but they weren't worried. As the evening wore on, daylight gradually disappeared. The roads became darker and quieter. Traffic thinned out. By late evening, they were traveling along isolated stretches of highway with very few vehicles around. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then they noticed a pickup truck. The truck passed them once. No big deal. A little while later, it passed them again. That was slightly odd, but still not enough to cause concern. Then it happened a third time. By then, both of them were beginning to pay attention. The roads weren't particularly busy, and seeing the same vehicle repeatedly was becoming difficult to ignore. Each time the truck passed, it seemed to slow down slightly. The driver appeared to be watching them. Neither of them liked it. Still, they tried to convince themselves they were being paranoid. Maybe the driver lived nearby. Maybe he was lost. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation. They continued riding. The night grew darker. The highway seemed emptier. And then they spotted the truck again. This time, it wasn't moving. It was parked on the side of the road ahead of them. Waiting, both of them immediately felt something was wrong. As they approached, the situation became even more unsettling. The driver got out. What happened next occurred very quickly. According to my brother, it became obvious almost immediately that this wasn't someone asking for directions or offering assistance. The man moved toward them aggressively. Every instinct screamed that they needed to get away. Without hesitation, they abandoned any thought of continuing down the road and ran. Not rode. Ran. They left the highway and sprinted across a nearby farmer's field. The terrain was uneven and difficult to navigate in the darkness. Behind them, they feared the man was still pursuing them. Adrenaline took over. They kept running. At one point, they encountered barbed wire fences cutting across the property. Under normal circumstances, they probably would have searched for a gate or a safer crossing point. That night, they didn't stop. They climbed, jumped, scrambled, anything necessary to keep moving. The barbed wire tore at their clothes and scratched their skin, but they barely noticed. Fear was doing all the thinking. Eventually, they managed to put enough distance between themselves and the road to feel somewhat safe. From there, they found a way to contact home. Around midnight, our family received a phone call. My brother sounded shaken, genuinely shaken. He explained what had happened and told us about the pickup truck and the man who had tried to grab them. At the time, nobody knew exactly who the individual was. All we knew was that something had happened out on that dark stretch of highway, and my brother was convinced they had narrowly escaped something terrible. Life eventually moved on. The incident became one of those frightening stories that gets told at family gatherings. But a few months later, everything changed. Police arrested a man named Clifford Robert Olson. The arrest shocked the country. Olson was responsible for the murders of numerous children and teenagers throughout British Columbia during the early 1980s. As details of the investigation became public, people learned more about his methods, the areas he frequented, and how he targeted young victims. The realization was horrifying. Based on the timing, the location, and the circumstances, authorities strongly suspected that the man who had approached my brother and his friend that night may have been Olson. There was never definitive proof. No one could say with absolute certainty. But investigators apparently believed there was a strong possibility, and that possibility alone was enough. Suddenly, what had once seemed like a frightening encounter with a random stranger took on a much darker meaning. My brother and his friend had always believed they were lucky to have escaped. Now they had reason to wonder just how lucky they had actually been. Looking back, the most chilling part isn't the chase itself. It's the thought of what might have happened if they had ignored their instincts. If they had convinced themselves the man's behavior was harmless. If they had stopped riding and approached the truck. If they had hesitated for even a few seconds. Instead, they trusted their fear. They ran. They crossed fields in the dark. They climbed barbed wire fences without thinking twice. And because of that, they made it home. Whether the man truly was Olson or not, nobody can know for certain. But the possibility has haunted my brother ever since. Because sometimes the most terrifying part of a story isn't what happened. It's realizing years later what might have happened if things had gone just a little differently. At one point in my life, I worked as a security lieutenant at a National Guard airfield. It wasn't the kind of job that scared easily. Most nights were quiet, predictable, and honestly pretty boring. My responsibilities included conducting patrols, checking buildings, securing areas, and making sure nothing unusual was happening on the property. After a while, the routine became second nature. You learn every hallway, every door, every creak in the building. You know exactly what belongs there and what doesn't. That's why one particular night has stayed with me ever since. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning. The airfield itself was quiet, and I was conducting a routine patrol through the main drill hall and office complex. The building was large, but mostly empty during those hours. Everyone had gone home long before, leaving me as the only person inside. At least that's what I believed. I had already completed a thorough sweep of the building. Every office, every storage room, every hallway, every conference room. Everything was secure. Doors were locked. Rooms were empty. Nothing appeared out of place. Satisfied that the patrol was complete, I headed toward the front entrance. The building was silent, the kind of silence you only experience in large facilities late at night. I stepped outside through the front door, and then I heard it. Footsteps, not faint footsteps, not an uncertain sound that could be mistaken for something else. These were clear, unmistakable footsteps. Someone was running. The sound came from inside the building directly behind me. It sounded exactly like a person sprinting down the hallway and turning right. The noise was so obvious and so realistic that my training kicked in instantly. Without hesitation, I drew my sidearm and spun around. Someone was inside the building. Someone who absolutely should not have been there. I rushed back through the door and into the hallway. "Stop!" I shouted. No response. The footsteps had stopped. Adrenaline surged through me as I moved down the corridor. The hallway wasn't particularly long. At the far end sat a set of heavy double doors leading into the motor pool area. As I approached them, one thing became immediately clear. The doors were closed. Not only closed, locked. I checked them myself. There was no way someone had run through those doors without me seeing it happen. The timing simply didn't work. Whoever had made those footsteps should have been trapped somewhere in the hallway. Yet there was nobody there. I stood still for a moment, listening. Nothing. No breathing. No movement. No sounds. Just silence. I wasn't willing to assume anything. If someone had broken into the facility, it was my responsibility to find them. So I turned around and began clearing the building again. This time with my weapon drawn. I checked every office, every room, every closet, every corner, one by one. Every door remained locked from the outside exactly as I had left it. Every office was empty. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. Still, I continued. By now I was fully alert. My senses were working overtime. I knew what I had heard. There was no doubt in my mind. Those footsteps had been real. Eventually, I finished clearing the offices and entered the main drill hall. The room was enormous, open, echoing, and mostly dark. The moment I stepped inside, something caught my attention. A large freestanding fan was running. That immediately struck me as odd. I didn't remember seeing it on earlier. Maybe I had overlooked it. Maybe not. At that point, I wasn't sure. I stood there, staring at it. The fan continued spinning. The motor hummed softly. The room otherwise remained completely still. For some reason, I suddenly felt compelled to speak. Maybe I was frustrated. Maybe I was trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Whatever the reason, I called out into the empty hall. "Is anybody here?" The words echoed through the room. And then something happened. The fan stopped, instantly, not gradually. Not the way a normal fan stops when someone switches it off. There was no slowing down, no spinning to a halt, no gradual loss of momentum. It simply stopped. 1 second the blades were moving, The next second they weren't. It looked as though someone had slammed on invisible brakes. For a moment, I couldn't process what I was seeing. I just stood there staring. Then, the temperature changed. The air became cold, not slightly cool. Cold. The kind of cold that immediately grabs your attention. The kind that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. The room suddenly felt different. Heavy, oppressive. Every instinct in my body started screaming that something was wrong. Very wrong. I've experienced fear before. Anyone working security eventually does. But what I felt in that room wasn't normal fear. It was something deeper, a feeling of absolute dread, the overwhelming certainty that I did not want to be there anymore. I wish I could describe it better. It wasn't just the cold. It wasn't just the fan. It was the feeling that accompanied them. The sensation that something unseen was standing there with me. Watching, listening, waiting. That was the moment I decided I had enough. I didn't continue investigating. I didn't stick around to figure it out. I turned around and got out of there. Fast, I crossed the street and returned to the main airfield area where my office was located. Once I was back in a place with lights, radios, and other people nearby, I finally started trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe there was a mechanical issue with the fan. Maybe I had misheard the footsteps. Maybe stress or exhaustion had affected my perception. I wanted there to be a logical answer. So, I did what any reasonable security officer would do. I reviewed the security footage. Surely the cameras would explain everything. The building had surveillance coverage throughout the hallways and common areas. If someone had been running around inside, the cameras would show it. I sat down and watched the playback. What I saw only made things stranger. The cameras showed absolutely nothing unusual. No intruder, no movement, no mysterious figure. Nothing. Just me. From the camera's perspective, I looked like a completely unhinged security guard. One moment I was calmly finishing my patrol. The next I was suddenly drawing my weapon and running down an empty hallway while shouting commands at nobody. Then I spent a significant amount of time searching a building that appeared completely empty. There was no evidence supporting what I had heard. No proof. Nothing. Just me reacting to something the cameras couldn't see. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it somehow made the experience worse, because I knew what I had heard. I knew those footsteps were real, and I knew what I felt in that drill hall when the fan stopped. Years have passed since that night, and I still remember it clearly. I remember the sound of someone sprinting behind me. I remember the locked doors. I remember standing in that enormous room, staring at a fan that should not have stopped the way it did. Most of all, I remember the cold, that sudden, unnatural cold, and the overwhelming feeling that I was not alone. 2 weeks later, I quit. People can laugh about it if they want. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation hidden somewhere in all of it. Maybe there wasn't. All I know is that after that night, I never wanted to spend another 2 o'clock in the morning alone inside that building again. I've always been terrified of ghosts, demons, and anything even remotely paranormal. As an adult, I've tried to be rational about it. I've always told myself that ghosts don't exist, and that there must be explanations for the strange stories people tell. But when I was growing up, that was much harder to believe. Part of the reason was my grandmother. She was a deeply religious woman, but she also struggled with alcoholism for much of her life. She often claimed she could see things that other people couldn't. According to her, demons were everywhere. She would talk about spirits moving through the house or standing around family members. As a child, those stories terrified me. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night to find her standing beside my bed. Without saying much, She would dip her fingers into oil and draw crosses on my forehead while I slept. She genuinely believed she was protecting me. To a young child, however, it felt incredibly unsettling. Whether her stories influenced me or not, I don't know. What I do know is that the strangest experience of my childhood happened shortly after my great-grandmother's funeral. At the time, I was probably 6 or 7 years old. Like most kids that age, I didn't fully understand death. I knew everyone was sad. I knew there had been a funeral. But I didn't really grasp the permanence of what had happened. A day or two after the service, my mother took me to my great-grandmother's house while she helped clean and pack up some of her belongings. The house felt different than usual. Quieter, emptier, almost as if everyone was trying to avoid speaking too loudly. Before we arrived, my mother told me that other relatives might stop by throughout the day to help sort through things. That seemed normal enough. The adults would work, and I'd find some way to entertain myself. After a while, I wandered through the house by myself. I ended up in my great-grandmother's bedroom. It was a room I had seen many times before. The furniture was old-fashioned. The curtains were drawn partially open, letting sunlight spill across the carpet. Everything looked ordinary, at first. Then I noticed a little girl standing in the room. She looked to be around my age, maybe a little younger. She was wearing a yellow dress covered in small pink flowers. I wasn't alarmed. My immediate assumption was that she was one of my younger cousins. My mother had already mentioned that relatives might be stopping by, so seeing another child in the house didn't seem unusual. The little girl smiled at me. "Do you want to play hide and seek?" she asked. Being 6 or 7 years old, my answer was immediate. Okay, she volunteered to be the seeker. I remember her walking over to the bed and putting her face down as though she were counting. Everything seemed completely normal. Without wasting any time, I hurried off to find a hiding place. The problem was that I was terrible at hide and seek. Absolutely terrible. My idea of a brilliant hiding spot was the closet located at the foot of the bed. I climbed inside and quietly closed the door behind me. Then I waited, and waited, and waited. At first, I expected to hear footsteps, maybe giggling, something, anything, but there was nothing. The house was silent. Eventually, I became bored. 10 minutes felt like an eternity to a child. I remember thinking that if I stayed hidden much longer, I deserved some kind of championship trophy for hide and seek. Finally, I decided enough was enough. I reached for the doorknob, and that's when things stopped being fun. The door wouldn't open. I tried again. Nothing. The closet was locked. At first I thought I was doing something wrong. I twisted the knob harder, pulled, pushed, nothing happened. The door remained shut. What made it even stranger was that it wasn't the kind of door that normally locked. There was no simple twist lock, no push-button lock, nothing obvious at all. Yet somehow I couldn't get out. The panic began slowly. Then it exploded. I started pounding on the door. I screamed for my mother. I cried. I kicked. I pulled at the handle with everything I had. Nothing worked. Nobody answered. The small closet suddenly felt much smaller. The air seemed hotter, harder to breathe. I remember crying so hard that I could barely catch my breath. My chest hurt. My vision began narrowing around the edges. Even now, years later, I can remember the feeling of absolute helplessness. I was convinced nobody could hear me. Convinced I was trapped. I don't know how long I remained inside. It felt like forever. Then, something happened. The doorknob turned. Slowly, deliberately, the door swung open. Relief flooded through me instantly. For a split second, I expected to see my mother standing there, or another family member, anybody. Instead, there was nobody. The space outside the closet was empty. The bedroom was silent. The door to my great-grandmother's room was closed. I stood frozen, trying to understand what I was looking at. The closet door had opened. I knew it had, but there was nobody there. That realization hit me all at once. Every bit of relief vanished and was replaced by pure terror. I bolted. I ran across the room and threw open the bedroom door. Then I sprinted down the hallway as fast as my little legs could carry me. At some point during my escape, I completely lost control of my bladder. A trail of urine followed me across the plastic runner in the hallway. I didn't care. I was too frightened to care. I just wanted to find my mother. I burst out the front door and into the yard. My mother was standing outside talking to a neighbor. The moment she saw me, she looked confused, then annoyed. I was crying hysterically. My clothes were soaked, and I was babbling so fast I could barely explain what had happened. Instead of immediately understanding, my mother naturally assumed I had simply frightened myself. She scolded me for wetting myself and tried to calm me down. Later, when I finally managed to explain about the little girl, things became even stranger. My mother told me that no other relatives had come by that day. Everyone else had gone to another family member's house after the funeral. There had been no cousins, no visiting children, no little girl in a yellow dress, at least none that anyone knew about. To this day, I have no idea what happened in that house. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation. Maybe I imagined the little girl. Maybe I accidentally locked myself in the closet and panicked. Maybe a draft or a faulty latch caused the door to open. I've considered every possibility over the years, but no explanation has ever completely satisfied me. What I remember most clearly isn't the little girl. It's the feeling of being trapped. The sound of the doorknob turning by itself. The sight of an empty room waiting outside the closet. And the overwhelming fear that sent me running through the house as fast as I could. Whether it was a ghost, my imagination, or something else entirely, I still don't know. All I know is that I went into that bedroom to play hide-and-seek with a little girl. And as far as anyone else was concerned, there was never a little girl there at all.